Hi, everybody. This is the first of what we hope will be an ongoing series of SLF panels, workshops, classes, etc., centered around writing. And today, I'm Marianne Mohanraj. I'm the SLF director. I'm here with my co-host from my podcast, Benjamin Rosenbaum, and we're your dowdy panelists for today. And we're going to talk a little bit about where we get ideas for writing, and also how I also want to talk about, like, how do you decide which of the many ideas flurrying around you might want to work on? So Ben's also the author of The Unraveling, which came out, when did it come out, Ben?
June 2021.
June 2021, so not even
I'm looking for one to hold up.
Little baby book. And it's fabulous if you're interested in far future, gender explorations, family stuff, etc. Okay, so Ben, I'm going to start by asking you, where do you get your ideas? I don't know the answer to the question. So put you on the spot.
Well, I mean, this is the very typical question, right? One of the thing I always like to say, I feel like I'm going to be repeating things I've said on various other panels, because this is like one of the oldest questions in the book. The main thing I think about this is that we are full of ideas all the time, but we're trained out of that, right? Like when we're little kids, like you hang out with little kids. My son today was babysitting some kids ranging, I think, 5 to 1. And I was like, what did you do? And he was like, they turned me into a frog, and then they turned me into a wizard. And then if you're playing with little kids, they are just fountains of imagination. And that's, I don't think that there's anything biological that happens that keeps us from doing that. I think we learn not to. And that, our brains, and in some sense, our brains are constantly like imagining things, but we get sort of channeled into all imagining the same things. I just saw an interesting Medium essay about this. I don't remember the author, but like, nations are made up, borders are made up, money is made up, but we're sort of all, rewarded and punished for like imagining the same things all the time. Anyway, what I noticed when I first wanted to be a writer and wanted to have ideas, I would sit down in front of a page and go like, okay, now I should have an idea. And that was not a very good recipe for doing it. And my very practical hack is just always have a notebook with you. Just have it in arm's reach of the shower, or like tucked into your back pocket on the bicycle. Because if your mind wanders, we're constantly censoring ourselves. When we're not thinking, now I need to have an idea, we're constantly thinking of all kinds of nonsense. And but we edit. We learned in school from first grade on, like, that it's very easy to be wrong, and it's bad to be wrong, and you should know what you're talking about before you say anything. And so we're constantly being like, what if this? No, that's a stupid idea. I mean, we tell ourselves, no, that's a stupid idea. We don't even listen anymore. But if you listen carefully to your brain, you're telling yourself, no, that idea is stupid 100 times an hour. So essentially, it's an unlearning, really, to start just allowing yourself to have the ideas that you have, and waiting a minute before squashing them, and just write down all the crazy, mad, wild things that are in your head. I'm trying to think of a non-ableist way to say this. Okay. All the wild, imaginative things that are in your head. And I mean, apropos, I don't think it's, I think it's actually not my error there, where I struggled for non-ableist language, is not unrelated to this problem, because in fact there is a tight coupling between mental health ableism and like the squashing of the imagination. Like, in some sense, that's what we're afraid of. That literally is what we are afraid of, that the wildness of our internal life will spill over, and other people will see it, and they will regard us as not conforming to like the consensus reality. Like, that's what we're all so afraid of, that keeps us, from daring to go off the garden path. So yeah, advisedly, madcap. So that's idea number 1 for generating ideas. Just let yourself have ideas and write them down, even though your brain is telling you that that's not what the teacher wants you to write down.
Yeah, I think there are a bunch of different things that come in to stop you from thinking your idea is good enough, I guess is where I see it a lot with my students. In my day job, I teach at the University of Illinois in Chicago, and I teach fiction writing sometimes. And especially in my intro level students, they will either they're going to be censoring themselves because, you know, this idea is too dangerous, it's too, you know, taboo, my mother will get upset if I talk about this publicly, you know, so there's that kind of thing, too wild perhaps, but also not good enough, I think, is something that a lot of my students, especially the ones with really strong internal editors, struggle with, right? That they're comparing themselves and this idea to, I don't know, War and Peace or Shakespeare or something, and saying, oh no, this isn't that good, and therefore
and
write it. Yeah.
And importantly, they're comparing it to the final draft of War and Peace.
That's right.
They're not comparing it to the first weird, you know, like dumbass thing that Tolstoy thought that was the beginning of the chain that ended us up in War and Peace. Because I'm sure it was I'm sure that it was a dorky idea, the very first piece of War and Peace, you know.
So what I find, I like the notebook thing in theory. In practice, I would never carry a notebook around. So I was trying to think of what would be another helpful technique for, you know, what you really want is to get back to this generative kind of state where the ideas are flowing freely, or I am almost picturing like a meteor shower, right? Like where they're just kind of sleeting across your brain all the time, right? Whenever you decide, I want to think about story stuff, oh, there's an idea, there's an idea, there's an idea. And the one thing that I found useful when I was, at one point I was away doing a weekend of game design, and they did a timed exercise where for 10 minutes, you were supposed to come up with 10 different ideas for games that you could play. And when they said this to me, it sounded impossible. I mean, I was like, how can you possibly come up with 10 decent game ideas in 10 minutes? That's ridiculous. But then they set the timer going, and you start writing. And in fact, it was remarkably easy to generate for everyone in the room. We all generated 10 ideas in 10 minutes. So I think there's a way in which you kind of build up what it is to be bigger than it is, that can get in your way, right?
And that brings me to my, and that is very much dovetails with my second practical suggestion was going to be, and I would say even more strongly, it's much easier to come up with 20 ideas than one idea. If you are asked, if you tell yourself, okay, I've got to come up with a good idea, that is, you know, like a recipe for being frozen, right? Because your brain is trying to come up with a good idea. It's focused on the good part, and it's like, this has to be better than all the other possible ideas, and that often is paralyzing, or gets you stuck in the quicksand. Whereas if you tell yourself to come up with 20 ideas, just write them down, 20 ideas, like they don't have to be good. Like it's far more likely that a couple of them will be good, or maybe all of them will be good once you get away from yourself. But also, good is like, we apply the metric of good much too early in the process, you know, because at some point you have to decide. At some point, the editor is important, your internal editor. At some point, deciding what's good and what's bad is important. But so often we're stifled because we're doing that, you know, before there's any room for anything to breathe. Like it has to. You don't even. How are you gonna know if it's good when you first have the idea? And so, writing down 20 things, the pressure of having to just keep your hand moving and do it is extremely useful, because it takes that pressure off of them all being pristine. And also, relatedly, what you said about once the timer started and you're moving your hand, I don't know if this is true for everybody, but having some external trace, like there's marks on the paper, there's something in your fingers on the keyboard, even speaking aloud, like speaking your ideas, I think that does something. Like my current pet, completely unsubstantiated neurological hypothesis is that actually that is communicating to other parts of your brain. Like when you think you're thinking a thought, your consciousness is shining a spotlight on some little process that's happening in your brain, but not everybody's heard about it everywhere. Once it's out there, then once you say it or write it, it stabilizes your internal chaotic discourse to be like, okay, we're all looking at the same thing. So I think often we try to just have ideas and we just start thinking them. It's very hard for that to stabilize into anything that gels. If you just make yourself write it on paper, the act of writing it down has a remarkable effect. And What's that?
Well, I want to hook you up to an MRI now, but and run experiments on Benjamin's brain.
Yeah, right.
But this is, I mean, what you're saying is we have researched some of this, right? And I'm thinking of Freud and interpretation of dreams and what he says about when you have a nightmare, you're supposed to tell it to somebody or write it down. And what we have found is that the act of doing that literally moves the memory from one piece of your brain to another piece of the brain, right? And so, and that's why you calm down in the process, because it takes it out of, I want to say, the amygdala, where you've got all of your adrenaline, fight and flight stuff going on. So it's very effective. It's really interesting. So I think you're probably right.
I think there's a loop. Like you write it, you see it, to think like you're bouncing back and forth between your mind and the paper. That's a whole different experience than just trying to have a bunch of thoughts without that physical trace. A last thing I want to say though, before we move on, is you said, well, I would never actually carry a notebook around. When I was originally dispensing this advice like 20 years ago, that was a big ask to I still think maybe somebody should take initially when they're trying to get started on block, literally carry a notebook around. But the thing is that now in 2022, you have a notebook. It's called your phone. If you watch all those documentaries about like Taylor Swift and Billie Eilish, all those songs are written on the Notes app on an iPhone. You know what I mean? You can always write something down.
But Benjamin, I don't carry my phone with me all the time. So in fact, I don't carry it most of the time. So I'm just old and weird. So I don't like carrying it. But for the rest of the world, yes.
Carry a pen and write it on a nearby wall. Anyway,
okay, that's right. So,
I like what Dan H says in the chat. I think the exercise is write 20 ideas down. Don't stop until you get to the end. Don't decide which ones are good, and then go back and see which ones echo at all. And you could actually iterate. You could say, well, these 3 are kind of interesting. For each one of those 3, let me write 20-second paragraphs or 10. What are 20 more things I could do with this? You could kind of blow it up in that way. But yeah, I think it's really just making it 2 steps. One is getting it out there, and the other is then worrying about what you want to pursue.
I mean, so I'll say I find this kind of thing helpful for if you're at the stage where you don't have ideas. It was helpful for me as a newcomer to game design because I had no idea where to start, right? It's not how I write fiction, right? This is not the process I go through when I'm coming up with ideas for fiction. I think this kind of thing is helpful if you are stuck, if you are either new to it or just have hit a blank spot, you've hit a wall, dry spell, however you want to call it, right?
Yeah.
So I thought we could talk about maybe a little.
Well, I do it. I mean, I do this. The thing about fiction, once you have a robust fiction writing practice, I don't need any new ideas because I'm not going to live long enough to write all the things I want to write. Right. So that's not quite the same problem. But I do this writing down a bunch of things when I am stuck often on micro detail levels, but also things like anything that's particularly emotionally laden where I'm I just don't want to go there. I think there are times even.
I think it's a great technique. It's just not one I use. So
okay, go ahead.
What's
next up? What do you do?
Well, I would say I'm trying to think. But when I started writing, what I was doing was mostly I would say storytelling and kind of autobiography, and I think that's really common, right? So the first 20 stories I wrote, at least half of them, and I was in college at the time, at least half of them were very thinly veiled anecdotes of things that happened in my dating life, right? And I just made up character names and wrote it down. And they're good stories. It was the kind of story that if you're at the bar and you're hanging out with your friends, you're let me tell you this story. Let me tell you this thing that happened to me, right? So I think that can be a really great way in for people if they're what should I write about? Think about well, what's something that's happened to you that you'd want to tell a friend about, right? What's, this thing that my boss did, or, you wouldn't believe, what happened when I asked my mom if I could do blah, right? So sorry, I have a lot of college students who are.
No, that's 18, great.
So,
I will say contrapunally, and I partly say this because I think it's always good to illustrate how diverse writers are, that I have never pulled that off. I don't think I've certainly things where I'm oh, okay, there's an echo of my life in this, especially realizing that in second draft. I always wanted to do it. I always related to my life as material. When stuff would happen, I'd be this is going to be great in a story later. Never once actually.
Yeah. I mean, I was writing
So
mainstream lit at the time, right? So, and not science fiction fantasy. So, but I could
sure.
basically take, much of that material and, rewrite it in the eye and turn it into memoir, right? And it, so I think, but even if you can't, I think it's a good exercise just for practice.
Yeah.
I think, like if you are,
Yeah.
if you are stuck, just thinking about what makes a good story, what makes an engaging
what I
story,
would
what's
do,
going to keep people's attention, what's going to make people laugh, right? It's helpful.
one thing that I would do in that regard is just write, and I don't think this is. I think also sometimes we, especially nowadays, as a like with a writing practice where I'm like, I want to do these, I want to get out words and I want to use them all, right? Like I'm a little bit distanced, and I think it's sad, from the attitude I often had when I was starting out, where I was like, this writing is for itself. Like, we'll see. It was kind of unattached. And I think that's actually, I should do that more. I should just journal more. I should be more, I think that actually is, and sometimes I do come back to it, that is like a wellspring, not writing in order to, I'm going to get these words done because I've got to go into this thing that I'm producing, but being like, I'm just going to be with these words and we'll see what happens. And in that mode, I would write down memories or just things that I overheard. It doesn't even have to be like something particularly charged about your own life. It's just interesting as an exercise to sit in a cafe once people can sit in, if you're in a region where people are currently able to sit in cafes without dying, and just write down conversations you overhear. Like, there's something about connecting to life around you that, and then something will spark, and it may be something completely nonlinear. It may be that like you're deciding you're going to write about this really important thing that's part of your life, and there's no energy there, but mashing it up with the conversation you just heard from people who were waiting for their coffee, like now all of a sudden it's a new thing, and that you can pursue.
Yeah, I think for me, it was definitely a process getting to fiction, right? Like I was in grad school and my advisor was reading some early draft of Bodies in Motion, and she said, okay, Marianne, these are great, but at some point you're going to have to start inventing things. And I was like, no, that sounds very hard, right? But otherwise, if you are, writing mostly about yourself, you end up with a book where like all the protagonists look like you, are your age, et cetera, so on, right? And so that was probably the spur to when I started thinking about, okay, what about if I tell a story from the point of view of this character's father, right? Or her brother who disappeared during the war, or whatever else it might be. And that for me was a helpful way in, because I already knew part of the story, right? I already knew the main character, the original main character's story. And so then I didn't have to invent that much. I know invention is not hard for you, but it was hard for me. So.
Well, I think what we're seeing here, I think what's interesting here is that there, I mean, we're sort of, it's an arbitrary axis, but it's nice to sort of array people, like present two alternatives. I mean, 2 point big line, and it's like, it's useful to know that you might not be like either Marianne or me. This isn't the two kinds, but it's useful to know that some people need to hear at some point you need to start inventing, and other people might need to hear at some point you need to start revealing yourself. You know what I mean? Like those are maybe two different sides of the same coin.
Yeah.
Another thing I wanted to say was that so often taking things from life. So, okay, two things. One is often it's useful to find how close you need to be something or how far away from something you need to be. There's a way in which often, I think I was just reading this in Delaney's about writing, where things often have energy. So Delaney, yeah, I actually do remember in About Writing, this book by Samuel Delaney,
great book,
one of our faves. He talks about how when he had been a professional writer and he went into academia, and he had been in academia for about a year. So he'd been like a visiting professor in one place, and then he'd worked in another place. He wrote this novel, which was all about like academic politics and like, all of it, it sort of all these types, sort of, characteristic types or like things you would see in that environment. It was like, had all these insights into academia. And then he's writing this book, and he's like, now that I've been in academia 16 years, I would never write that book. Like there'd be no energy. Like I know it's too invisible. It's the water I swim in. But I had just arrived and just just learned enough about it that I could see it as a thing separate from myself. I was like, ooh, this will be interesting. But once I've been doing it for 16 years, I'm like, what? I don't know anything to say about that. So there's sometimes useful to find something that's just far enough away. The truism is right what you know, but it can be hard if you don't know anything about something. It can be difficult to write about it, but if you know it too well, it can also be difficult to write about it. When I wrote wanted to write a far future story set in Europe, I live in Basel. It's too close for me to write about Basel. Basel is too many things. I have too many associations with Basel. It's you know what I mean? Like, it's everything from the grocery store to it's a jumble. Frankfurt is a city that's like, a couple hours, maybe 3 hours away by train. I spent some time there. I spent a couple of weeks there on and off. I kind of have a visual image of the city. It's not like me writing about Ulaanbaatar, where I would just be totally doing research and pulling things out of my ass. I feel relatively confident I could kind of nail Frankfurt or ask somebody, but it's far enough away that Frankfurt feels like a thing to me that I can conjure up, as opposed to feeling just like a jumble of everything. So the takeaway is, consider looking for things that are the right distance away from you.
It's interesting.
Which could also mean relationship-wise, you know what I mean? It could be like, maybe your aunt's easier to write about than your cousin or than your sister, or you know what I mean? Like, I don't know.
I feel like this is almost like I land in a different place almost for the same reason as previously, right? I have trouble filling in the blank spaces. So it's actually easier for me to write about things that I know incredibly well, right? So once I get to a point where I'm immersed in something and I've had lots and lots of thoughts about it, I can then start writing about it and just ignore the bits I don't want to deal with, right? So whereas something, yeah. So in any case, this is not to get too psychological. I wanted to hit a couple other points, and then Dan had a question I wanted to get to. The two other things that when you are starting to mash up, other people's experiences and also getting it from the outside world, I wanted to say, one, you might want to think about, is this your story to tell? And the reason I'm saying that is because when I first started publishing, I had relatives who would come to me kind of upset and be like, don't ever write anything about me, right? And I, you don't say to someone, well, your life is not that interesting that I'm going to come in like that. That would be mean to say. And I'm sure their life actually is that interesting, except I don't know the interesting
from
part.
the right viewpoint.
Right. Yeah. So, but I don't know what those stories are. So they should tell those stories. So I think I've certainly written things that were inspired by, various people I know, relatives, people I've dated, etc. But I think you do have to be, I think there's a little bit of an ethical thing to think about. If you're basing it on something real and particular and specific that's identifiable, right? Where anyone who reads it is going to be like, oh, you're talking about this person and this thing that happened to them. Just a question of whether I'm not like making a conclusive thing, but I have to think about whether I think this is my story to tell.
But I want to dovetail that though with the thing we were saying before about the moment in which you censor, right? Like, you don't want to, like, yes, I don't think you should spend like a year of your life on something before taking a moment to think about whether it's a good idea whether this is something you would want to put out in the world if that's what you're writing it for. But on the other hand, I also think 5 minutes is not the right amount of time. You know what I mean? So there's a way in which I think a lot of that censoring, I mean, you said, well, maybe it's because we think it's too out there but I think there's a lot of ways in which we, there's writing with the door closed and writing with the door open. And in the privacy of your notebook, like, there's something to be said for being completely inappropriate and wrong and bad, because you can always, you're not going to show it to anybody.
Yes. It's not really it's not really the writing, it's the writing versus the publishing and that is what second drafts are for. And there, you can think about it again before you have to go. And there's a way in which I am a very tentative, harmony seeking person. I don't want to mess up anything, and I don't want to hurt anybody. And I
And so I sometimes bend over backwards in that direction. It's useful to give yourself the space to just be like, now I'm going to say all kinds of, I'm just going to let all this stupid shit out of my brain. And notably, I mean, there's a political aspect to this too, which is that your brain is absorbed all kind of oppressive bullshit from the society that you live in, right? We've been taught all these wrong things. And if we treat them as even an internal taboo, where we can't even admit them to ourselves that this is in our head, then it kind of never gets out because it's kind of stuck there and we can't look at it. It's this thing. And to actually write down a bunch of shit and then go back and go, oh my God, that's gross, right? That's this, I just wrote the thing where the hero always, like, as long as he does the right thing, he'll get the girl. And it's kind of her obligation given that he, checked all the boxes. Like, fuck that. That's bullshit. But you've seen a million rom-coms that plot. So if you're afraid of even writing it down, it won't ever come out. It'll just be there. To write it down and then be like, okay, not doing that is great. You can write down things that aren't right and then react to them. And a similar thing, you could write down some, deeply private confidence that you shouldn't be revealing and be like, okay, so I wrote that. That's not what I'm going to publish. What do I now do to transform this to make it something that,
Yeah,
so that's.
I agree.
Yeah.
I do, and I think sometimes you can transform them. I think not always. I have one story I wrote that will never see the light of day because I just wrote it as it happened, and it was incredibly painful for the people involved, and I was just a witness to it. And nobody needs to hear that story from my point of view.
And there's lots of reasons why a story is done. I mean, there's lots of reasons why you write something, you give it a shot. You don't need to any more than an athlete needs to win every game. You don't need every story doesn't need to work. And you may learn a lot. It may be a useful. It's like or no more than a scientist needs to prove every hypothesis. Like it's if the result of it was like, wow, okay, I'm not going to publish that. Sometimes that's moving forward. And let's answer Dan's question.
Wait, no.
Okay,
sorry,
one more thing.
I have one more thing. Is that the main other place where I get my ideas these days, which has shifted quite a lot, is from politics and the news. Sort of merged with my life. So for example, I have a story, Plea, that was published in Lightspeed. I think it's on my website, but it's, the story is set on another planet. You've got these refugees, you have space whales, you have, sort of telepathy stuff going on. But the story came out of the Syrian refugee crisis, where I was driving into work, listening to the news on NPR and crying, because it was just all so awful. And at the same time, my 5-year-old son was getting pulled into the principal's office over and over and over for disciplinary incidents. And I was sitting there wondering how much of this is because his skin is darker. And I don't know, right? And so, and I was listening to these people on the news talking about, well, it's okay if we let the women and the children in, but not these brown teenage boys, right? They're dangerous.
Yeah.
And so all of that kind of ended up going into the story. So it was a mix of the news and my personal life. Similarly, there was an anthology, Welcome to Dystopia, where I just poured all of my anxieties about the Trump administration and what could happen to my family under it into the story I wrote for that anthology, right? So for me, that has become kind of the central place where I get my ideas. I write about the Sri Lankan Civil War and about, more and more about post-colonial and colonial history kind of translated into science fiction. So I just wanted to put that out there, as I know people who will read the news and just, there are great stories in a newspaper, and to kind of say like, oh, let me take this story of which I have 10 lines of fact. Here are the things that happened, right? And then how do I turn that? Can I turn that into a rich fictional iteration of it? I still have one that I haven't written yet, but I was reading about the tsunami in Sri Lanka, and this woman who they interviewed who had lost everything, but what she was really, really upset about was her wedding sari, right? That had, and that she'd lost, her husband had lost his boat, they'd lost their livelihood, they didn't know how they were going to eat, but this was the thing that she fixated on. And like, someday I got to write a story around that moment, right? That image is really what is compelling to me. So I don't know. So I wanted to put those out there as like other ways of approaching this. I don't know if Ben, yeah, go ahead.
it's not that I want to answer Dan's question and then not talk about how to generate ideas. I have 10 more ideas how to generate ideas. I just want to give an answer to the question, then I'll react to your thing.
We'll read
just
the
because.
Yeah.
Okay, Marianne Benjamin, what do you typically see for time frame from inception of idea to draft and then publishing? Also, how many revisions would you expect once you have a draft? So I think this varies wildly. I tend to be very perfectionist and thorough, and I would say, I mean, like, but there is a range, because sometimes I'll write something really short and I'll be like, yeah, that's good, and basically look at it again in a week, touch it up, and ship it. And then there's my novel, which I think I figured out that it was, certainly I had the idea and was like ready to get started by 2008. And, you know, much of the time between 2008 and then 2020, you know, was spent revising, not continuously. You know, I got it to a point and I was like, this is good. And then I would send it out. And then, you know, then for a couple of years, I would try to get it to agents. And then I was like, all right, well, now I'll revise it again. And then so there was, you know, but it varies widely, right? Like, I don't know. What would you say?
Well, I'd say, so if I'm talking about it, short stories versus novels are different for me. So I would say for a short story, what I typically do is I have the idea. If it's still in my head a day or two later and I keep thinking about it, I try to set aside some time to like really let my brain mull it over and think about it. So for me, my life is very chaotic. There's a lot of stuff pulling at me all the time. So I usually have to kind of carve out a space for deep thinking. So something like going for a walk or even taking a long shower, with sort of starting that. Swimming is great for this for me. Like I go and do 30 minutes of laps at the pool, but I start off thinking about, okay, I'm going to start by thinking about this bit of the story. And if it's fertile, right, things will evolve, right? I'll get more ideas. I will maybe start to hear characters talking, get to a point where I have a sense of what I think the ending's going to be, which may change, but at least I have some sense of the story arc. And then I almost like let the pressure build up until I have a bunch of dialogue and I'm kind of desperate to write it down. And that's when I then let myself go and sit at the computer and write. And at which point it could be, 4 hours to a full draft, right? Like, boom. And that's a pretty common short story process for me. At that point, then who knows how many revisions. Like sometimes it comes out beautifully and it's almost perfect, and sometimes it's 10 revisions and I'm still not happy with it. So, that's all incredibly varied, I think. So I don't know
and I don't also, no, that was great. I just want to caution, like that last bit about sometimes it comes out perfect and sometimes I'm still unhappy with it. Right. But also that could land like the good ones are the ones that come out perfect. But actually it's, you know what I mean? Actually it's like, or the other way around, but it's like, the revision isn't always a process of just fixing problems. Like I'm unhappy with it and I want to fix the problems. Often revision is like a really interesting part of discovery. Like it's not like writing the story was, what you meant to say, and then the revision is like this unfortunate task that, like a lot of times you start with something and it's a little thin, and then in revision you discover like what it really should be about. So so it's very varied.
Well, I think it's been close to 40 minutes, so maybe we can open it up more formally to Q&A, and you guys can direct us towards anything we haven't covered that you'd like us to cover.
I mean, I still have a couple of ideas though.
I know,
we jumped in to answer that question.
But we're making a space for Q&A first. And then if
Sounds good.
No one has any Q&A, then we can
No one should.
So Dan asks about a particular story of mine, Communion. So and where I got the idea for that. So I feel like I'm giving away my secrets. You guys are going to be much less impressed with the story once I tell you. But I will tell you anyway. So Communion is a follow-up to my novella, The Stars Change. In that novella, there's a character, a lizardy guy, a police officer who ends up sacrificing himself to save other members of the community. So in Communion, his brother has shown up to collect the remains. And the two things that came together and crystallized the story for me are two other pieces of fiction. What is the line, like, good writers borrow, great writers steal outright, something like that. So I stole outright from Diane Duane and Robert A. Heinlein. Heinlein has this bit at the end where Michael Valentine Smith is this very self-sacrificial figure who asks his followers to make themselves into soup, make him into soup after he dies, and eat the soup, very Christ-like imagery. And I was raised Catholic, so hence the title communion, et cetera, so on. So this is all kind of embedded in my cultural framework, even though I left the church when I was 12. And then the Diane Duane piece is in The Wounded Sky, which is a Star Trek novel. She has this character, Katilk, who comes from a race of sort of spidery creatures where they have like black widow spiders, basically, where they kill their mates in the process of mating and incorporate their genetic material into their children. And they eventually figure out how to do this without killing the mate, but by that point, it's become like a massive part of the culture. And so, and you know, the people who do this, their kids end up smarter and faster and whatever else. So those two things came together into the story. It's a good question because I think that one's a really good example of how a host of different elements came together. And in this story, he's come to take back the body. There's very little of it left. And after this bomb explosion, and they end up making soup and sharing it among them, so that he can take the memories. He will take the memories back to his community, the parts of his brother that are passed on. So I don't know. I hope that helps. Sorry, if you guys haven't read it, it's free to read. It's on my website.
Well, I mean, I think that's really dovetails with something I wanted to say, which is that another place that we get ideas is in reacting to things we read, and that is a, you know, like that there is this sort of anxiety of influence or whatever, this embarrassment of like, oh, I got it from here, you know, which you hear in your answer, but like that is like it. I mean, there's a positive way to see that. It is a community, it is a conversation, and often, I mean, I said this in the podcast, I think one of the best things for generating ideas is a book, not a book that you just love so much that you're like, oh, I could never do anything like that. That's just perfect. I don't want to go anywhere in it. And not a book that you're like, ugh, that's crap, I'm not interested in it. But a book that you really like some of and really hate other parts of is sometimes great because you're like, oh, yes, yeah, oh, no. And then that's where, you know, your brain is like, no, move aside, let me drive. You know what I mean? Like that moment where you have the like, no, geez, really? No, come on. And there, you know, you're like, there's a piece that you want to imitate, connect with, and there's a piece that you're like, but this is missing. That is sometimes a very powerful place to generate ideas from.
When I first started writing, I was writing poetry a lot of the time, and I would go to poetry readings all the time. And the most energizing were the ones where I was like, this is a bad poem. I can do better than this. Why is this person published and I'm not? And, you know, I would literally take the idea that they were working with and go off and write my own version of it. And I don't know that it was actually any better than theirs, but it was very motivating.
Well, I mean, that's one aspect. Sometimes bad writing can be motivating, but sometimes writing that you love, but there's some flaw to it. You're just like, oh, if I could only, or, you know, like, I don't know, like, I just, not an example from my writing, but you get the sense that's how Scalzi is about Heinlein, right? So John Scalzi, like very programmatically, is like Heinlein juveniles, except if you actually go back and read Heinlein juveniles nowadays, you're like, ooh, there's so much that's cringeworthy here. So it's like the stuff that he loves about that vibe, except the way he wants to do it. You know, anyway, so I think that can be a fruitful vein.
So I'm going to pull Teresa's question out. When you sit down to write ideas, do you write the story linearly, or do you write pockets of scenes and then fill in the gaps? And then I'm going to connect that to Dan, who says further on Teresa's question, I attempted to employ an outline, keep the ideas, fill in later, much later on occasion. And Darius agrees that outlining can be helpful. in making his ideas come to life, but also combine in interesting ways. Okay, so all of that together, I would say, again, like this is different for me to some extent for short stories and novels, but so I'm going to stick to short stories for now. I usually don't bother to write an outline before doing a short story. But I have sketched out in my head the arc of the story. And what I'll often do is, especially if I have to like stop partway through, I will have written out a scene. And then when I go to the next scene, if I don't have time to just keep writing, or I don't have writing, or I just want to take like a 10-minute break, I will sketch out like, here are the main things that are going to happen in this scene, right? And then walk away, right? Come back, and then that gives me a starting point for filling in the rest. So it's not an overall story outline, but it is kind of a scene by scene outline. Like I'm looking one scene ahead at every point. Ben, I don't know.
So there are famously people talk about how there are plotters and pantsers. So there are people who write their entire book or story like on index cards and have everything plotted out, know everything's going to happen before they sit down to actually write the prose.
And I think we're actually going to do an entire panel about this in a month or so.
Yeah, and then there are people who like fumble their way through the dark, reaching for each word. I tend to be much more on the pantser end of the spectrum. When I have tried to write to an outline, it just be like, and in chapter 17 this will happen. Now write that and do it out of order. I end up, it dies because I don't believe it. Like I end up writing that and then I go and write that and then I'm like, but by the time we get to this, then I'm trying to cram people into the outline. But that is just me. There are lots of people who are extremely successful with that method. Don't listen to me if it works for you. In fact, I'm so bad that often what I do is, particularly at story length, I will go and revise like everything I've written so far. In a way, just read through everything I've written so far, just to hold the whole thing in my head. For a novel that's harder, I do end up having to outline, but my outline, or even a longer story, but the outline is often a kind of scaffolding. I don't really expect it to hold, and it's almost as much about figuring out what I've already done as it is about like necessarily determining what's going to happen in the future. I do sometimes have filler, like I do sometimes have like bracketed like a bit where it's like later I'll come back and figure this out. But I find that I can't do that for very big chunk without sort of losing the thread of the vivid dream. But that is literally just me.
The first time I tried to write a novel, I did an outline because I thought that's what I was supposed to do. So I did like a 20 chapter outline, and then I wrote the novel following the outline, and it was terrible. It took me a long time to understand like what had gone wrong there, but I think it drained the life out of the book. So I had already done all of the fun figuring out what was going to happen parts. And so then it ended up feeling very mechanical, writing just kind of like filling it in. And I was not giving myself permission to change things and be creative anymore. And so it was dead. Like it was just a lot of that book ended up being very boring for me to write, boring for other people to read in that draft.
That's actually what Octavia Butler said at Clarion. She said she did not outline because if she wrote an outline, like a detailed outline, she no longer had to write the book, like she was done. What she would do is just a sentence, which I would have like the protagonist, their conflict, and like the resolution. So she needed to know where she was going, but any more than a sentence, and it would begin to sap the energy. But again, everybody's different. Some people do a great job of outlining it all in writing too, and more power to them. So.
And I have friends who do, who are really good at writing commercial fiction, writing it very fast, and I think they get a lot of their joy in the scene by scene dialogue and the details of the descriptions and so on. And they get plenty of energy from that. And many of them have to write to an outline. Like if you're writing for Harlequin or something like that, you actually have a script you kind of have to follow for the book. So there's that aspect as well.
I also think there's a distinction between different kinds of outlines, and something that I was confused about in the beginning is the difference between like an outline and a synopsis, or more broadly, the difference between something you create as scaffolding for your own process and something that you create as like a sales document to show other people, which are like sometimes not even vaguely related. I mean, not, like they just fulfill very different purposes. And to try to write the pitch and then use that as the guide to write the book does not always, it can be useful, but it isn't. I mean, I've only found that useful when I then have a whole lot of freedom to change my mind and decide that wasn't what I was going to do after all.
Yeah, I think
another question.
You want your, well, this I think goes to Teresa's question. So Teresa asks, to develop characters, do they appear organically as you write and the story unfolds, or do you know who your players are before you begin? And, you know, I just read an interview with Margaret Atwood, and she was saying that, you know, for every writer, there's going to be a different reason as to why they write. So some, she said, some write to like justify God, some write to get revenge on their high school teacher, I mean, you know, whatever it is. But I think for myself, I'm often writing to work out problems in my head, right? I am troubled by something in the world, the behavior of people often, right? And often connecting to politics in some way. And so I will start with characters that are kind of stuck in that situation, whatever the political situation is that I'm looking at. And then I think I let them surprise me a little bit. I think about, you know, well, how do some people behave? How do other people behave? And then when I'm writing the story, sorry guys, I think the choices that they make reveal their character, right? So, I mean, that's kind of what, I think that's what character is a lot of time, is like, how do you, what choices will you make facing this situation? When Trump is elected, do you flee the country or not, right? For example. So, I don't know, Ben.
Yeah, well, I will say, I mean, so yes, everything you said, the thing that I see in this question is sort of like, what is the impetus of the story? Or like, what are you beginning with characters? Or are you beginning with, and for me, it varies, again, very much from story to story. I think there are different, I mean, I think the through line is that something, if you have a whole bunch of ideas, we started by saying, you know, you brainstorm 20 ideas, which ones do you follow? There has to be something that tugs at you about the idea that has energy for you, that's unresolved, or that you really want to get your fingers on. Enough that will pull you through the writing of the story. You know, it has to be an internal pull, and it's often something that you don't entirely understand. Like if you have a complete theory, it often makes for thin fiction if you have an absolutely clear opinion that you want to clothe in a story. Like it's often much more energetic if you have something that you're worrying at, kind of like you're saying. Or something that just strikes you. It doesn't even need to necessarily be that something you think is, you don't need to consciously regard it as being like some important thing. It could be completely silly, but if for whatever reason it has energy for you and pulls you in. So I would say that there's almost like, I can quickly think of 3 different modes that I could get into a story. So some stories I begin really without much in the way of characters and just with world building. Like sometimes I have thought a lot about how something could work. Often it's kind of like an intellectual, playful idea. Like, you know, I had a good example of this is when the first story I wrote when I was at Clarion was I'd been kicking around this idea about you know, it turns out much later, I'm not a Star Trek fan, turns out much later that they already had this on Star Trek. But I've been kicking around the idea of like, and I don't think it was exactly the same, but a symbiotic species in which the memory was all like a symbiote, and the person was like their entire memory, which I think is not how it is in Star Trek. Like they had no memory without the symbiotes. The symbiotes were all memory, they didn't have any cognition. So the brain, all the functions that are unified in our brain were distributed across these 2 symbiotic species. I didn't really know. I was trying to figure out what their society would be like, how that would interact. And Octavia Butler, this was the first week of Clarion, said, you free write on an unpleasant experience and then just turn the page and start your story in a world you already have. So I just did that. And that gave me the characters, but I didn't really know who they were in the beginning. So in a way, it was like I wanted to explore this world, and I like had, you know, the characters just kind of emerged. Other times, though, like Le Guin says about the Left Hand of Darkness, this character shows up and starts talking to you, and you like want to find out who they are and like who is this person and what are they like and what, but you have a strong sense of them. And I've had that too, where it's just like, I want to know who this, I see this person in this situation, they're doing a thing, I have an inchoate sense of like who they are. I want to follow them around and see what they're doing. I don't even know what the world is like. They're the window on the world. They're wandering around. That's going to illuminate what world are they in. And then a third way is to begin all. Yeah.
I want to just give a quick example of the second one.
Sure.
Like this first or second story I ever wrote when I was in college, there was a girl I knew not very well, born and raised in the US, whose parents sent her to India for an arranged marriage. And she went and married the guy and settled there. And I didn't know anything more about it. And so I wrote a story with just this girl doing that and trying to think about, okay, what is a scenario that would lead to this? And I invented a whole whatever thing, right? And so none of it was her actual thing, but just picturing that person doing this was the seed for, and then it evolved.
So I'll throw an example that is like completely topical right now, because I literally have this in my head right now, which is this tangentially introduces another thing, which is research. I've really gotten into research. It's kind of fun, and often like story ideas are generated out of things that you didn't know. As I'm reading this book about medieval Jewish communities and how they dealt with like crime and just criminal justice, because they didn't have any authority to imprison or execute or even whip anybody. So essentially the only way that they could shun people, that was about it. And if somebody was shunned and they were separate from the community and they wanted to come back in, they could have this voluntary penance thing where they would send people in exile. And so if somebody murdered somebody, but they wanted to be back, be able to have their children marry and be able to go to synagogue, whatever, they would intentionally go for like on purpose. They had to agree to it because they had no authority to make them do it, to go for 3 years to wander around in exile. And the hand that they killed the person with, they would chain to their belt so that the hand was immobilized, just the hand that they killed the person with. And then but if they got to, they couldn't stay in any community longer than a week, but if they got there by Friday, they would take off the chain and then put it on at the end of and I'm just like, who is this guy? Like, I have this image of this guy who's like walking around with his hand chained to his belt. Like, anyway, so a way in can be a character. Like, who is this guy? Why did he do it? I want to know. Last way into a story is just purely language sometimes. And I wanted to say this early on in the generating ideas thing. One thing I did to generate ideas often when I was first writing stories is write the weirdest sentence I could think of, not with any logic behind it, and then try to make it make sense. So just write like, an orange ruled the world, or Sheila exploded and the air was full of gumballs, and then be like, what the hell does that mean? Like, I don't know who Sheila is. I don't know why there are gumballs. I don't know what this is orange is doing. Can the orange, but like, just start with language. Like, I like the way the sentence sounds, and then have that be a way in. Sometimes that's enough, and then you don't know who anybody is, but you're figuring it out as you go.
And I'll note that Ben's story, The Orange, that starts with that line, it's like a one-page story and was published in a small press and then picked up for Harper's. So it did very nicely with that little opening there.
Very strange story. But I mean, that's the thing, is like, so what is this? And sometimes that's, again, once you have it down on your paper, it's ways for different parts of your mind to talk to yourself. You're like, somebody came up with this line. What's going on there? And it's almost like you're interrogating yourself and things that you don't even know, that you this cooperation between all these parts of your mind, some of which you don't get to talk in the workday world. One of the fun parts of being a writer is that you're exploring this unconscious stuff that you don't necessarily understand in the way that if you're performing the character that you have created of yourself, which everybody else knows and finds socially acceptable, and saying all the things that person would say, and coloring in inside the lines, you don't always get to hear from all these hidden depths that we all have.
All right. Do we have any more questions? We're kind of to the end of the scheduled time, but I know Ben has more things that he would be happy to say. So we'll just keep going as long as we have the energy. So Teresa asks, do you know any tips, tricks to help those writers who have issues with anxiety, perfectionism that can stall your writing? So my first one is, I think I mentioned at the beginning, the timed writing, super helpful. Setting a timer, there's something about that just, it like triggers a different part of your brain. You're like, oh, the timer's going. I guess I have to write now.
Natalie Goldberg, Writing Down the Bones, is a classic text on that. That's the one, right? Writing Down the Bones, and also Wild Mind. Classic text on that, where she gives sort of like you a pep talk and very simple rules for like, write down, go for the jugular, keep your hand moving.
Yeah, keep your hand moving is something we say in creative writing workshops a lot, and it's super helpful. It's amazing how people who would otherwise stall out, once I would also say, if you have it in you to take a class, because many people respond to authority, and having a teacher tell you, well, you have to write now can be enough to get you actually going, right? So, or if not a class, have a buddy, writing buddy, and an accountability buddy, just like going to the gym, and say, okay, we're going to meet each other on Zoom every Saturday from 11 to 1. By the way, we have SLF co-writing from 11 to 2 every Saturday. So you could come join us there.
Central time.
Central time. Yes, I'm in Chicago. So everything runs on Central time here. But what's great about that is that you get together, you maybe have 5-10 minutes to chat. And then again, you set a timer and you're like, okay, we're going to write for 45 minutes. I'll see you at the end of that time. And now you owe it to somebody to be writing, right? And I've also, if you can be in the same place, if you're meeting at a cafe, sometimes I have writing days at my house where my writer friends come over and I put out snacks. And there's something very motivating about seeing somebody else's fingers moving on the keyboard. You're like, oh, my fingers should be moving on the keyboard. And if you go over to social media and then they see you there, then you both feel really bad. So you're like, oh no, we have to close Facebook and go back to writing our manuscripts. So
that particularly works with the right. That works particularly with the right crew, because you can also end up in a thing where you just chat all the time and don't write.
You need some strict rules. I think most of us need strict rules because it's really easy.
And I think the right, it depends on, you have to try it and see if you vibe with those people, or if you just get distracted and write and talk. The I'm interested in the question because there's different stages at which anxiety and perfectionism can stall writers out. So there's the just getting started at all with anything, in which case we mentioned the like 20 ideas in a row. Do you want to say more about, or are they okay? There's
I just figured out my video, so.
Oh, no worries. Because I'm curious in the follow-up which particular thing, but there's the very beginning. There's the keeping your hand moving, which is very good for just first drafting. But of course, anxiety and perfectionism often, another failure mode is like, I've revised this 100 times and I'm still afraid to send it out, right? And that's another thing that I think it can be helpful. I mean, one thing I would say there, so a couple of ideas I have because I've been there. A couple ideas for getting off the treadmill of like, oh, it's not perfect yet. One is that to try and reorient yourself to a mindset, instead of optimizing for success or it being good or something, to try to optimize for learning. So it's not like, the question is not, is this as good as it can be? The question is, will I learn more from moving on to the next thing, or will I learn more from digging in on this? Because I think that can be a very powerful, because then you're also seeing yourself as like a person who's going to write a lot of stories, who's going to have a big writing life. It's not just, this is the last thing and I'm totally invested in this. It's like, well, maybe let's kick this out the door and go to the next one, because maybe I'll learn more writing 4 stories this year than having this one take all year. And that can be very helpful. And setting up little games for yourself. So, I mean, famously, I've told the story, but one thing I did when I was first writing was I knew that sending it out would be psychologically hard for me, because I knew I was very likely to get rejected. I had been told that I had to paper my wall with rejection slips, and I knew intellectually that was the case. But I knew that what would happen when I got the envelope and opened it up, this was back in the days when we had paper envelopes for our rejection slips. When I opened it up, I'd feel sad, and then that would make me not want to do it anymore. And I would build an aversive cycle. I'd be less and less likely to do it. It'd become more and more of a chore to send it out, and I just drop it altogether. I knew that would happen. So I wanted to train my brain that rejection was good, because rejection was a stepping stone on the way to acceptance. Like I had to get rejected a bunch of times because I had to learn, because it was about learning. And the process of actually putting my foot down and saying, okay, this is done enough, let me send it out and see what happens, and doing that again and again, story after story, was like part of the cycle of learning. So what I did was I made a chart, I'm gonna have here somewhere, it's downstairs, which I made a chart where I wrote the name of the story, when I sent it out, when it came back, and what happened to it. And I gave myself 1 point for a rejection, a form letter rejection, 2 points for like a personal rejection if they said something about it, and 10 points for an acceptance, because that about modeled what I thought I should feel. I thought I should, like, acceptance is amazing, but rejection is a tiny step on the way to my goal. And then I decided that if I got 100 points, I would go to Clarion. Because it was a big deal to go to the Clarion West writing workshop. It's like taking 6 weeks off. I was like, am I really serious enough about this to do it? But I was like, well, if I've sold 10 stories, I probably don't need to go to Clarion. I didn't know that then. But if I've gotten rejected 100 times for form letter rejections, at the minimum, I have demonstrated enough tenacity that I am obviously not giving up on this. So I might as well, really do it. So that changed my attitude towards the rejection slips, because instead of feeling bummed out by rejection, I started to feel bummed out by waiting. I started optimizing for the people that would give me a fast rejection, because I was like, great, thank you, 1 point back in the envelope, and that created a virtuous cycle where I felt like, well, I'm learning, I'm getting stuff out there, and I'm learning, and these rejections are like showing, And again, I think just physically having the trace, like actually not just keeping it in my head, but like having it written down, on a spreadsheet or a piece of paper, is like, okay, I'm at 50 points. That's awesome. I think that was extremely useful. So I would say, and the same thing Marianne said about having a buddy, that can also be really helpful in the process of sending it out. I haven't actually done this, but I feel like for people who are in that place where it's like, do I send this out? I'm afraid. It's a very natural place to be. All been there. It's actually might be useful to have a buddy and you turn over to each other the keys. You're like, this is my story. I think it's as good as I can get. Here are some markets I like. Don't tell me anything. Just keep it out there. Like, let me know if it sells. Like, otherwise, never mind. You know what I mean? Like, just give them the keys and have them send it out for you.
You have to trust a friend to follow up with that. I'm like,
yeah, sure. You have to trust a friend.
Not a flaky friend. So
yeah, a less drastic version would be you send it for me, but CC me, or like let me keep me posted or whatever. We'll check in. But I think the idea of somebody else being like, okay, I think it's a lot easier to take your friend's story and be like, oh, it got rejected from Asimov's. Let's send it to FNSF. You know what I mean? And you're less likely to agonize. So I'd love to see more of a buddy system happening. Anyway, so all those things you can do to trick yourself into just getting to the cycle of learning and it's related to this idea, because I think we're trained from first grade to feel like failure is the thing we're trying to avoid, as opposed to stagnation is the thing we're trying to avoid, because failure is like great. You know what I mean? Like, in a way, I mean, it's not great. It sucks. Don't get me wrong. I don't want to be too Pollyannish. It feels bad, but objectively, it is correlated with learning. Because if you're not putting yourself out there and trying big things, you're not going to fail. Yeah. And if you do put yourself out there and try big things, you will sometimes fail. And in a way, I think it's kind of I think it's kind of a dangerous thing to never fail. Like, if everything you do succeeds, you're kind of in a dangerous place, because that one failure, I don't want to throw my dad under the bus, but he had this very, very successful career his whole life. And when he finally, like, his business failed when he was like 60, it's like really hard for him to deal with, because he didn't know, he hadn't had that experience. And it was shattering when you're 60 and you've spent your whole life winning at business.
And I think
that's great.
This is
so it's good.
Really common thing. I think it's a really common thing among bright kids, right, for whom school comes easy, is that they often don't learn how to deal with anything that doesn't come easy, right? And so I see this in my kids. I will say the school, I think, has gotten way better at emphasizing growth mindset, as they put it, and really, not. They're at least trying to get the kids to be more open to failure, and it's fine. That's just an iterative part of the process, right? I think it's different from when we were in elementary school.
Yes, probably is different. I'm a Gen Xer here, so when I say first grade, I meant my first grade in the 70s. But maybe it's better now. But I think still that hasn't gone away from our culture entirely. This fear of failure, this trying to always look good, and I think that something that you can do is set up incentives for yourself and structures that you'll stick to get you just in the game, like winning or losing. But you got to get in the game. You got to get on the court.
Well, I want to talk about the structure a little bit too, because what actually worked. So when I was first writing, I did not have a lot of anxiety. The stakes were very low for me. I was doing it for fun. So I would write things and I'd post them on the internet, and people would comment, and it was great. And then I started trying to publish. The stakes were still kind of low because I didn't expect to make a career out of it. So it was great when I got a publication, and not such a big deal if I didn't. There came a point where I sort of I'm going to be a writer, and suddenly the stakes were much higher. And then I sold some books and the stakes were much higher. I paid off my student loans with one of the books. So I'm like, I could really do this. And then the next book was canceled, my big novel at HarperCollins, and I was crushed. I didn't write for a year, right? And so then I had to kind of work my way back. And I would say I'm still, ever since that point, which we're now talking 2005, it's been quite a long time, I still have this anxiety, this lurking, I'm not going to write a novel that's good enough. It either won't get published, or even if it does get published, it'll come out and be ignored and blah, blah, blah. And I suspect I will never be free of that again, which is I sort of miss the carefree 20-something writing days. But what does help me now is ritual. So for me, I first had to figure out when could I write in my busy schedule. So you have to carve out the time. And if you don't really have the time, or you haven't made space, even if that space is 20 minutes on the bus, right? But it doesn't have to be a lot of time, but something that you've sort of set aside for it, it's just really easy for days and weeks and months to go by with no writing happening, right? Because there's always other stuff pulling at your attention. There's always a crowded drawer full of chords that I could organize instead of working on my story, right? Thinking about that chord drawer right now, it's a very painful chord drawer. So one is setting aside the time, and for me that actually works best if I can wake up early. So I'm right now in the middle of shifting my schedule earlier. My goal is to get to waking up at 5. Because I write best in the mornings. And so if I can do 2 hours of writing before the rest of the world wakes up, I'm golden for the rest of the day. It almost doesn't matter what happens the rest of the day, right? So that's what I'm working towards. But in terms of ritual, I have a sequence. So when I was writing Bodies in Motion, I would get up, I would make my tea or coffee, whatever you drink, take my meds, eat something, usually something small, but eat something. Food is fuel. And then I would go to my computer, I would light a candle. It was dark. I was actually getting up at 4 a.m. at that point. So I'd light a candle, open the computer, set my music going, open the file. That was the sequence. And I had to do all of those things. And within a week, it became a habit, right? It doesn't actually take that long to build habits. And once it was a habit, once the file was open and I started just, reading the last paragraph of what I'd been working on, the writer brain took over and I started wanting to keep writing. It's getting yourself over that anxiety hurdle to actually open the file. At least for me, that was where I got stuck. And another trick that I don't use, but I've seen people use, is when they stop writing for the day, they stop partway through a sentence, so that they know when they start the next day, they have an easy, they're just going to finish the sentence and then go from there.
I've heard that called parking the car downhill.
Nice. Yeah, I like that. So
I mean, a corollary to that is that's I love that story about you and the candle, but it's also a very particular situation where you can be this is the thing, which is, at that point you were, a grad student, you were this could be your total focus. A different situation if you're I don't know, a parent of young kids who's working, you know what I mean? Some 5 a.m.s, maybe you could write, other 5 a.m.s, you didn't get sleep till 3, everything's chaos. More difficult to establish ritual. but something that, I mean, you can still establish elements of ritual, but one thing that I find useful, juggling lots of heterogeneous schedule and trying to carve out writing time, is tracking. And what's interesting about tracking is not so much the reward and punishment aspect, but actually that I find it makes me more forgiving of myself, because I have a longer view. Because if I don't have any record of what happened, I base everything on what happened yesterday. Like if I wrote yesterday, I'm like, yes, I'm great. And if I didn't write yesterday, I'm like, oh, this isn't going anywhere. It's hopeless. And if I have a little graph of like, well, you know what? On average, I write this much, and it's gotten a little better, or it's gotten a little worse, or oh, this spring sucked, but fall was better. I don't know. Like both it allows me to see patterns, but also it just gives me the sense of it being a long haul, and I can have a goal that's not all or nothing. It's not like, oh, either I'm great or I suck today. It's more like, let's try and get our, moving average up to like 200 words a day by the end of next week. It allows me to be both engaged with what's going on, like actually see it, not be in denial about it, but also be sort of just more realistic, less hyperbolically like it's either good or terrible, more forgiving in the sense of being like, all right, well, that's not too bad. Let's, I missed Wednesday and Thursday, but Tuesday was good, and Friday is going to be, what I mean? Like, yeah, it's just kind of, so that, again, seeing it as a process, seeing it as a work in progress, seeing it as an environment, optimizing for learning and for sticking to it, as opposed to deciding every day that I'm either doomed or the greatest thing since sliced bread, right?
There's also some apps and sites that will help with this. I'm forgetting the name. There's one that's specifically like writing word count stuff. And Darius and Manuel, I don't know if either of you remember the name of that one, but one that's more generalized is Habitica, which I used for a while. And you can just set whatever it's like. It's got sort of a D&D themed background. I think it's free to join, habitica.com. And you set whatever goals you want. I want to floss my teeth every day, or I want to write 3 times a week. And then you check it off, and you can create teams who are all doing it together. And the points that you get go towards, I don't know, eventually you accumulate loot like swords and pets and cute outfits. Right?
There's also for the words, which is
the
like
words. That's
something
what I was trying for. The words is the other one I was trying to remember. Yeah. So similar.
I just use a Google spreadsheet so that I can give like a chart with a line, but it's whatever works. I was going to say something else about that. I forgot it. Keep going.
That's okay.
It'll
that
come to me.
That was most of what I had. And so, are there other questions? Anything we're missing?
Oh, the last thing I want to say about the carving out time is the other thing is that I am super distractible. If there is anything I can do other than write, I will. And I think that I used to try to, there's something in psychology called the fundamental attribution error, which is that and I think particularly, that's literally its name, we as particularly, this is probably true of fiction writers, because we're very interested in character ever since Shakespeare and Jane Austen and whatever. We think the character is the determinant of who you are in the world. But like, as it turns out, if you measure people psychologically, like what's a far better context is often a far better predictor of behavior than like personality or character, right? So like, character is important in the sense that it's built out of habits, and habits are whatever, but like a lot of times it really has a lot to do with context. If you I don't know, there's a famous experiment where they give a bunch of preachers, students, like seminary students, like they have them read about the Good Samaritan, and then they tell them they have to go to this other building, and meanwhile they pass a guy who's like lying on the ground groaning. And like, it's like, what does it correlate with? Whether they stop and help the guy? Does it correlate with like whether they read about the Good Samaritan or whether they were thinking about their job prospects? Does it correlate with their personality type, their history? It mostly correlates based on whether you tell them they're late or not. Like if you tell them, yeah, they're running a little late, don't worry about it, take as much time as you want, they'll stop and help the guy. If you tell them, you really better get over there, they won't help the guy. So my point of the story is, a lot of times we beat ourselves up. We say, who am I that I didn't do this? Like, oh, I'm not watched up for this. When really it's just the structures. It's just like arranging things a little better for yourself would make it predictable you would do the thing. And once I stopped trying to be like, how can I be a better person who's more determined and have more willpower and write more, and started focusing on like, what could I change about my life that would make this happen? It got a lot easier. And I mean, before there was a pandemic, I would just get out of the house, go to a cafe, and lock my computer in a mode where I couldn't get to the internet. Like if I had to use a computer, I would be like, this is a child account that can't go to the internet. It can only write. And then I would write. Whereas if I tried to stay at home, there were dishes and I could surf, like I wouldn't. And that was like, well, whatever I don't know about my character, but like the structures determine that I will write or not write in these two different scenarios. And when there was a pandemic and I had to stop going to cafes, I had to invent a whole new system because, that screwed up my productivity. But so anyway, I would say
so much of this is tricking your brain, right? Like there's all kinds of research on this that shows things like, if you're trying to avoid snacking, if you have a covered candy dish on your office desk or an uncovered candy dish, you snack a lot more from the uncovered candy dish. Literally, the act of taking the lid off is enough to deter your brain from
we're not, we're not these floating rational beings, right? We're like mostly composed of like a bunch of brain loops that are like, oh, attention, and so I
use apps like Freedom, Self-Control to keep me off time sucking social media. To some extent.
Yeah.
More.
So I would say whatever, and everybody's different, but I would say that the overarching thing is just figure out what makes it predictable that you will actually do the thing that you want to do, and don't worry about like your character. Don't judge yourself. Just be like, oh, it turns out that when this and this is set up this way, I write. Okay, I'll do that.
Nice. All right. Well, I think we've changed topic entirely, I think. So we should wrap up. We have one more person in the call, Moulton. I don't know if you have anything else you want to throw in the chat or ask us before we go. Now's your chance. But if not, I think we'll sign up. I hope this was helpful and interesting. We're gonna save this, and Darius will edit a clean version and we'll throw it up on the SLF's YouTube channel. And we will be here next week with, I think we've got editors. We've got Neil Clark of Clark's World Magazine and Lynn Marie Thomas of Uncanny Magazine, two of the top magazines in the field. And we're going to ask all of the questions. So it's going to be fun. All right. Thanks.
Thanks, everybody.